Cashing in my pockets so my pennies should be. What they selling is cheap, so I'm buying that this freedom is free. I've been becoming me. See when Jesus taking the lead. With purpose I bleed and rise like going under the heat. Defeat is a never. You can't reattach with a sever. What's bringing you pleasure can tell you where you stacking your treasure. When storm is your weather, know that it gets worse for it's better.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Esau McCauley podcast. I'm your host, Esau McCauley. Today on the show, we have my good friend, Jamie Aten. I promise we don't only bring Wheaton people on, but every now and then there's someone whose skills and expertise directly relate to the issues of the day. So could you tell us again, because I will probably say it wrong, Jamie, what is your title?
So I'm the Blanchard Chair of Humanitarian and Disaster Leadership and co-director of the Humanitarian Institute at Wheaton College.
Okay. Now, Jamie, I hate to sideline you as soon as I introduce you on the podcast, but we're going to get to you in just one second. We're going to talk about how you might think about disaster relief, particularly as it relates to the people who are suffering in California. But in the spirit of Christian charity, I have to reconcile with my fellow brother in Christ, our producer, Mike. There's been some tension going on behind the scenes that people might want to know about. And I'm going to recount to you all what happened, and then we can maybe move forward past this. I do it on the podcast. So Mike lost his keys at the office, and he sent out a group text to everybody who works at the...
Hang on. We had an all-day team meeting. Okay. And Esau was there. Caitlin was there. The whole Holy Post crew were there. And everyone left. I do a lot of work, Esau. Even after when you're gone... Yeah. Doing your thing, going to your shows and whatever else. I'm still working away at the office. Okay. And so I finally finish up and I go to find my keys and I can't find my keys. So you go ahead, pick it back up from there.
So then he sends a text to the group. Has anybody seen my keys? And I, being his brother in Christ, went and looked in the jacket that I had worn to see if the keys were in the jacket. So I texted him, "No, I don't have your keys." And he ends up having to take an Uber home because he couldn't find the keys.
An hour and a half, and I could not find my keys.
You're just adding details. You're adding details. That's irrelevant to the point. So the next morning, I wake up, and lo and behold, on the dresser across the room, there are some keys that I don't recognize. And I immediately think, oh my goodness, these could be the missing keys. But I don't want to admit that yet. So I want to call and text my wife, "Beloved, did you just buy a new car? Do we have a second house? Do you recognize these keys?" And come to find out, those aren't keys that she knows about. They are probably then Mike's keys. So I have an opportunity right here because he doesn't know where the keys are. I could have thrown the keys away and he never would have known and everything would have been great. But because I'm a Christian, I give him back his keys. And so I feel like he owes me a debt of gratitude because I returned the keys he otherwise wouldn't have. But he's like, you took my keys, you didn't really look for them, I had to take the Uber home. So Jamie, who do you think is correct in this situation? Me or the other guy?
You know, I have to say, this is the one question I don't think I was prepped for this particular interview. So let me actually reframe it. So the other thing I didn't mention is I'm actually a psychologist that does disaster and trauma work. So let me switch over to my psychologist hat. Yeah. And I'm going to ask you the most important thing that I learned of 10 years of education in psychology, which is, so let me actually turn that around. What do you think, Esau? How do you feel about this? Right?
I'm thinking, okay, I need to explain this, the sacrifice that I made. He now has this over me forever. And I made that sacrifice. Like, I gave him the moral upper hand. Had I thrown the keys away, he never would have known. Someone also asked me, like, could I have snuck the keys back? I didn't even get that far. I was thinking throw it away or confess. And I confessed. And so I just feel like I should get some more gratitude or some more credit.
Esau,
let me ask Mike, how do you feel about this?
Yeah.
It's interesting that Esau steals my keys, possibly on purpose. There's a track record here, Jamie, of Esau firing me, blaming me for his problems on the podcast, criticizing me quite often, frankly. And I immediately, when I could not find my keys, my first thought was, I bet Esau took them. But I graciously did not accuse just Esau. That would have been wrong. I sent a text to the entire group that was there. Had they, does anyone know where my keys are? And of course, Esau had them the whole time and decided, I think it'd be funny.
That was the part that is hypocritical about it, because he admitted it after I returned the keys that he thought it was me the whole time. That's what I'm talking about, Jamie.
But I was right.
He in his heart, it doesn't matter that you're right. It doesn't matter that you're right. You shouldn't have thought that thought about your fellow neighbor. Because I didn't steal them on purpose. I took them. It was an accident.
I never said you did it on purpose. I just figured, I thought you were the one that it was most likely to have taken my keys.
Okay.
Also, should we tell the story when you returned my keys that you demanded an apology from me?
I mean, let's go. You know what? We will put that to the side. Maybe at the end of the podcast, we will revisit it. Maybe we will let the commenters make a decision. Right now, we got to talk to Jamie a little bit. But thank you, Mike. And as a show of growth, I will not dismiss you angrily from the podcast like I normally do. I will say thank you for your contribution. I will now speak to Jamie, and we will talk about this later, maybe offline. Peace be with you, brother. Okay.
Goodbye.
Jamie. You do can you explain to us a little bit about what is your job? What is it that you do?
So I sometimes feel like I have two jobs. So, I teach here at Wheaton College, but my main role here is through the Humanitarian Disaster Institute. So in addition to training humanitarians and disaster relief workers that are going to go out in the field, I also go to the field, so I'll actually be going to California here in just a few weeks to be able to help with the wildfires, providing some spiritual first aid training. And ever since the fires broke out, we've been actively working with churches and nonprofits on the ground, helping to resource them with the resources they need to respond.
Now, how big is the Institute? How much staff do you all have?
So there's 8 of us altogether.
And you deal with every kind of disaster. It could be, fire, rain, storm, snow. It doesn't matter. Do you deal with disease outbreaks as well?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of, during COVID-19, we were doing a lot of work, especially with local churches. We've done outreach and stuff after the Ebola outbreak in Africa, as well as, when it happened here in the U.S. to a couple places. And then we do a lot of public health crisis type of prevention stuff, working with churches. And then all the way up to deploying to Ukraine, 5 months into the beginning of the war, to go there to do training.
So, Jamie, how did you get involved in disaster relief? Why did you decide to do this?
Yeah, well, this wasn't something I thought I was going to get involved in. It was never part of my plan. But right after finishing up grad school, I moved from the Chicago area down to South Mississippi just before 6 days before Hurricane Katrina struck our community. And so I got involved helping respond after that, doing research and training, and then started responding to a number of other disasters there throughout the Southeast. And then it started spreading, getting asked to come in and help consult even internationally, like in the DRC around civil conflicts, and things just continued to keep progressing. But I think sometimes, though, that it could truly be the real reason is that I'm a diehard Cubs fan my entire life. Oh. So I know what trauma and suffering is really all about. So I'm not really sure. I like to say Katrina, but it may actually be the Cubs fan.
Was your academic background, did it in any way prepare you for this? What did you do before you transitioned into this area?
Yeah, so my focus in graduate school was actually on rural mental health, and largely thinking about how do you work with mental health in more of a community model versus just your traditional one-on-one counseling. And so that's really what prepared me to do this work, because we were working always in under-resourced communities, trying to figure out how do you overcome stigma, these types of challenges. But I wasn't really prepared for disaster work. I remember one time in grad school, I had a professor that mentioned disaster mental health, I think maybe as he sneezed or coughed. And that was all the professional training I actually had until Katrina hit. So this was a lot of learning on the fly.
So I want to ask you, I have a sister who she's a pediatric cardiac intensivist. And so what she does pre and post operative care on people with upper respiratory illnesses. And so that means she spends a lot of time with kids who are sick and who are undergoing life-saving or life-transforming surgery, pre and post operative care. And she's also engaging with families of people who have those same things. And I remember one time before she went into that, she was actually thinking about doing children and cancer. And she did a residency or something with St. Jude's. And she said, well, I thought that, pediatric cancer was just too emotionally traumatizing. And then so she ends up doing like pediatric heart problems, which I just think is like two different forms of trauma. And so I've always thought I've always admired her, because me seeing sick children all of the time, that would have been hard for me emotionally to see that much suffering. Is it hard for you where like your job is only when things go wrong? Like you don't go and see like, here's a great community that's flourishing. Every time you go somewhere, someone's hurting. What is that like as someone? So what we're seeing, because it rose to the level of news in Chicago and in California, we all see it. But I'm assuming when you see stuff like this every day that people don't necessarily know about, how is that like emotionally or spiritually for you?
Yeah, no, that is an ongoing challenge. When you're working with this type of stuff all the time, that, sometimes I've asked, when I've been asked about like my job, I've sometimes said that my job is to sit around and think about the worst case scenario, right? And that can be hard. But one of the things that's really helped me through that process has been faith, but also family and friends, and I get to work with a great group of people, so just as an example, it's actually Kent's birthday. And so this morning, like I came into the office early and made a cake out of Dr. Pepper's, one for every year of his age, right? Like to catch him off guard with it. And then yesterday he was texting me knowing I was on an important meeting, trying to get me to laugh during the meeting. So, having people that do this hard work with you, but that you can also laugh with, has been such a godsend.
Yeah. So help us understand, for those of us who may not have the context in the background, what exactly is happening with the fires in California? What is taking place on the ground?
Yeah, so I was actually in the LA area the night that the fires broke out. So I'd been there for a series of meetings for that week. And so I was actually in a meeting probably about 8 o'clock at night or so. And one of the people around the table, their phone started ringing, and you could tell when they answered the phone that something was wrong and that they were having to actually leave because the fire was approaching their home. Thankfully, it stopped about 2 blocks away. But one of the things that's been so challenging is that area has been so dry. So I actually went for a hike before one of the meetings while I was there, and everywhere you just saw all the warning signs about how dry it was and how high the fire risk was. And so as it's broken out, it's been spreading because of the wind patterns that have been happening.
Can you say a little bit? I've read about this. Like, what was the drought like? Do you memory of the details around the drought that preceded the outbreak of the fire?
I'm not quite sure how long it was going on, but it's definitely been quite a while since they've had any decent rain in that area. And as we continue to see some of these climate change shifts and patterns, that these types of outbreaks are going to continue to happen.
So one fire breaks out in that part of California. Is there a reason why this, once again, very simple, why couldn't they put it out before it got too big? Like what happened to allow it to spread the way that it did?
One of the things with wildfires is it's very unpredictable. So if you think about other disasters, even the ones that you maybe aren't able to get as much of a warning, say like a tornado versus a hurricane, right? Like a hurricane, you've got a pretty good lead time. Tornado, those sometimes can pop out of nowhere, but the difference is with a tornado, once it hits your community, it keeps going or it fizzles out. With a wildfire, it can start to gain momentum and last longer, so that burn starts to become very sporadic and changes with the wind. And so all it takes is like 1 or 2 sparks from the fire to catch a different location to then start a whole nother fire. So it spreads much more rapidly and is much more unpredictable to be able to prepare for because of how quickly it starts to move and transition.
And so once this fire breaks out, I know there's been 1,000, one of the things about the internet is that everybody has an opinion. And so what quickly happens is that this fire, like a lot of other things in our society, quickly turns political. And so can you give us some context around some of the debate about responsibility? And can you say anything about how much of this is human error? How much of this is the tragedy that very few people could do anything to prevent?
I think it's one of those situations where all those different sources that you named are at play here. That there's politics, there's policies, and then there's just the reality of a natural disaster occurring. So it's hard to, at this point, to be able to really kind of have a good sense of, was it the policies or the, laying off staff?
No. That's completely wrong. I saw it on the internet. We don't
you
need
saw it on
this
the
much
internet.
time.
No. But if it's not, if it's a meme, it counts.
Yeah,
right.
It was a meme. I saw like 3 or 4 memes.
Yep, absolutely. But one of the things that we are seeing is that many communities, and even if you look like at the federal government at the federal level, the budgets to be able to respond to disasters are actually decreasing while you're seeing the amount of disasters drastically increasing. And so the other thing that tends to happen, and is a big problem with a lot of the policies.
You're saying this is a universal phenomenon, that in general, we are reducing our budgets to respond to natural disasters as they are increasing in society. Is that just because we're in a generally austerity age where we're trying to reduce taxes, so we're trying to cut where we can, and that's leading to a lack of funding? I know you're not a politician. I'm not asking you to make political stances. I'm saying, as you look at these patterns, this is what you're saying, that we, on one hand, want a lower budget, and on the other hand, we want to have the funding to take care of these things that are happening in our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you look at budget trends, even at the federal level, everything's kind of going up, but the disaster budgets aren't going up at the same speed. And one of the things that's happening is with the cost of inflation and just the overall, disaster, just the frequency, there's no way the budget can go as far as what it did previously. And so it's not a new problem. It actually dates back all the way back to Hurricane Katrina. And that actually shifted a lot of our policy and even philosophy of how we think about emergency management. At the time, Craig Fugate, who came in under the Obama administration on the other side of Katrina, implemented what he called the whole community approach. Because it used to be, before Katrina, everybody kind of thought, well, if there's a disaster, FEMA will come to your aid and take care of everything. But they were already starting to see, and then later on when Fugate came in as the director of FEMA, realized these disasters are happening too often and are becoming too extreme for any single agency to be able to tackle. So we really have to involve everyone, and the communities better as well. So this has been an ongoing problem, but our budgets are not keeping up. And then the other part that happens is that instead of caring for the vulnerable, we're oftentimes putting money, into other programs that are, helping maybe the wealthy, for example.
Yeah, one of the things that also I see, and on the one hand, I remember reading for years about climate change, and one of the impacts of climate change would be an increase in natural disasters that would grow in severity. And I remember that a lot of people mocked those things. And so once again, I'm not a climate scientist. But when I read, now some of the things they predicted didn't occur, that they were kind of bad projections. But as someone who kind of believes in this idea of cause and effect, broadly speaking, that if you destroy the environment and if you treat the environment poorly, the idea that there will be negative consequences seems to me to be not a esoteric kind of left-wing idea. And so is it an oversimplification? And maybe this is the reason why this becomes political. On the one hand, you have people who are saying, this is climate change. We told you this is going to happen. And other people saying, this is government mismanagement. This is what happens when you put the wrong people in charge. So is this a manifestation of climate change? Is that too direct a question to ask you? Or is it once again a little bit more complicated?
Yeah, it's not just a black and white answer to it, but climate change is definitely one of the biggest causes of this. But then on top of that, it's amplified by the type of urban kind of migration patterns that we have, where people are, living in more high risk areas. And then we also start to see the building up of those communities. So when you start having more concrete in a community, then that's one of the reasons too that I would be concerned about mudslides potentially happening in California on the other side of all of this, right? Because you've got this area where the ground is super hard. You've also got lots of, concrete everywhere, like sidewalks and streets that have been overbuilt, too many people living in small spaces. And then what starts to happen is not only is climate change going to impact and make the fires more readily happen, but then on the other side of that, when the water does come down, it's going to likely lead to mudslides or some flooding as well. So we start to see a lot of different patterns that are happening.
Jamie, that was not the most, I know you see this enough, so you said that relatively casually, but you're saying that after the fires, we can look forward to mudslides. So, I mean, that was a bit dark, but
it's not guaranteed, but there is going to be a risk of that. And you actually, even last December, when there was fires, it was preceded by a number of people dying from the mudslide there.
So one of the things that I want to maybe have our audience think about and have you think about is because I think that sometimes in the church, certain ideas get clustered together that have nothing to do with one another. And that something like believing in climate change is seen as associated with theological liberalism, that if you believe in climate change, you don't like the Bible or something like that. For the people who are concerned about climate change, who are in a context where there is still skepticism, and we're in a context where there's natural disasters, have you found a way, I know this may seem like a trite question, but have you found a way of talking to people about climate change that is helpful?
One of the best resources for that is Catherine Hayhoe, a Christian who's a climate scientist. And anything that she's written is a good place to start. So some of her books on the topic or recent articles, for myself personally, one of the things that I think that has helped is trying to approach those conversations, especially those ones that might lead to some conflict, with humility. And part of that comes from just, my own experience, but also even from some research that we did a few years ago. We actually had a lab study where we got people together on the kind of all those political or religious topics people say never talk about over Thanksgiving. Those were the topics we had them talk about, and then turned up the heat in the lab and asked them to discuss. And we actually already knew where people stood on it.
You mean physically turned up the temperature? You sweated them out?
Yeah, it raises aggression. and so we had people on the opposite sides, and we actually had run the stats to know who was the literal opposite of one another. And we put them in a room together, and it's like, hey, why don't you talk about this topic? And then we stepped out of the lab. And what we found, though, was that when somebody perceived the other person, even though they believed totally different, as being more humble, they were much more likely to view that other person as being reliable and to even hear what that other person had to say. So you're never going to win this by trying to, win by just talking louder, but instead having more of a humble approach.
So wait, are you trying to convince me that the exercise of Christian virtue and interaction might help persuade fellow believers about things? And
I think so, unless it's about keys. So, that's the only time it doesn't work.
About car. You got me with that. I was gonna say that. So that you mean that our internet quips aren't working? You own that guy. Smash the retweet button. So help me understand then, if this is potentially or probably related to the fires themselves and the climate change, related to the actions of a multitude of people, not just in California, not just in the United States, but globally. Am I then helpless as a Christian? What do I do besides argue with my neighbors that climate change is ultimately at play so that at least they can see the point? Is there something that we can do practically? Is it begin to focus on helping with the response because you can't fix climate change as an individual? What kind of tools do you want to say? If I believe you, Jamie, I believe this is the problem. I believe we're going to experience more of it. What kinds of things should we think about doing as individuals?
I think with all those different challenges, it really comes down to loving our neighbors, at the most basic fundamental level. Because if we're really having community with other people, they're going to be more open to us having different perspectives. But also, one of the biggest challenges after a disaster is people get so isolated from one another. And so having and knowing your neighbors, especially the neighbors that might be vulnerable, that when a disaster hits, you're going to be one of the first places people turn to, or you're going to need to be able to turn to them. So that neighbor to neighbor care is really so important. But I don't think it's something that we have to feel hopeless about, that we can make changes, and there are still lots of things that we can do.
So you said this thing that may seem once again you sound super Christian in a good way, Jamie. That's great. Loving your neighbor and having a relationship with your neighbor allows the neighbor to trust you when something like trauma occurs. Maybe if you then are a church, and maybe you could talk about this, a church that might be proximate to a trauma, a natural disaster, or a church that's far away. So for example, our church, we started a church. We're in Naperville, Illinois. We're not in California. Do we just send money to organizations? Because it feels like sometimes I've heard that the trips aren't always the most effective ways of service. So is there a default set of best practices for churches who want to help when they see these disasters?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. You saw how you kind of framed it out of, both churches that are close to the area as well as those that are further removed, because the way to respond is going to vary a little bit based on that proximity. But I'll actually start with what not to do. The first thing not to do is don't be an SUV, which is a spontaneous, unaffiliated volunteer, right? So kind of like what you were talking about, just hopping up and jumping into the disaster zone. You're actually going to complicate things. You're probably going to take a bed away from somebody that needs the bed. You're going to start to impact the local economy.
Do people just pull up?
Oh my gosh, it is one of the biggest challenges that emergency management faces. And in fact, they often talk about the disaster within the disaster, that you've got the actual event, and then the next disaster are the people that just start showing up that end up causing additional problems. But it's a catch-22 because we also need all of those people. So there's a way of doing it, and it's to plug in with an actual organization that's already doing this type of work. So if you're feeling that need, though, just to hop in your car, drive to California, across the country, don't do that, right? If you have a friend who's a neighbor and you've talked to that neighbor and they said, oh, actually, if the neighbor says, hey, I could use you to come help me right now, right? Then it's okay because you've got a place to stay. You've actually been invited into a community. But if not, don't do that just kind of spontaneous up and go. And if you're wanting to make a broader impact, especially if you aren't connected to the local community, it is the best practices are to connect with one of those organizations that you can volunteer through, because they're already coordinating across with the other community groups, with the state and federal agencies. And then the other is, if you're farther away or maybe you can't get there and volunteer through other organizations, it is to send money and to support those on the ground. But one of the things that often happens is that people don't like to send the money because it doesn't feel warm and fuzzy, right? It can feel kind of cold or distant. But the thing you have to understand with disaster work is, like, whenever I've deployed with teams, we spend our morning prepping and going through the day's plan. And then I normally end the plan by saying, and everything I've talked about in the last 20 minutes is now probably already outdated, right? Like, things on the ground just move that quickly. And so being able to have an influx of support for those groups on the ground in those communities is truly one of the best ways that you can help.
So it is like, there's just something about, there's that parable where Jesus talks about what happens in the last day. And he said, I was hungry and you gave me food and all of those things. And so, and even in the miracles of Jesus, it's usually personal. He's usually face to face with the person. And so I do think that sometimes it's hard for a Christian to feel like they've done their Christian duty when I said written a check. Nobody writes checks anymore, Jamie. I'm an old man. I'm washed. But I don't know what you would call it. Fill out the debit form. I don't know what you would call it. Initiate the transfer. But I think there is this thing where we want the endorphin hit, or whatever you want to call it, of doing some direct service. Mm-hmm. And that if we're honest, and I feel the same way too, if we're honest, that is actually centering our needs more than the actual needs of the victims, who sometimes just need a helping hand. I remember when I was at some point, I don't know where this came to. It's like, well, if someone who is poor needs money, I heard this in the church. Don't give them like the $20. Take them to a store because they might misuse the money or do whatever. And it's like, well, sometimes you can just give them the $20 and kind of go on with your business. So you've helped us a little bit think about like the practical sides of this. This is what I do. This is the ways that I can help. These ways I can get involved. But beyond the practical part, I think there's a spiritual issue that sometimes people kind of can deal with. In other words, these disasters that we're seeing, even if they're somewhat influenced by climate change and human action, it feels almost like this is something related to God. In other words, there are people who have a theodicy question, like, how do I make sense of a world where this isn't a war where like humans are killing other humans, and you can say this is the evil of man, but this is a disaster. This is a fire. How do we make sense of the widespread trauma that we see due to weather? And how do we make sense of this as Christians, these traumatic events?
So that's actually one of the things that I've spent a lot of time actually studying after a number of different types of disasters. And, you were talking about the difference of, say, war versus a natural disaster, right? That one of the things that we know from our research is that when there is a war or a terrorist attack, you start to see where people, if you can point or touch or blame somebody else, that then you have the direction and you don't see typically quite as many religious attributions, like, where was God in this? But with natural disasters, there's nobody that you can point and blame necessarily, right? And so we do tend to oftentimes ask a lot more of these kind of theodicy questions after a natural disaster.
And I should probably, for the people who don't spend all of their time doing biblical study stuff, theodicy is just the way that Christians talk about the problem of evil. And so that's what we meant when we said theodicy. So how have you, in your own mind, made sense of this issue then? How have you reconciled the two? A good God and fires burning everywhere.
Yeah, well, for me, the question of theodicy, I've experienced that a lot and wrestled with it, in disaster zones all over the world. But where I struggled with it most was when the disaster hit me personally. So actually at the age of 35, I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Grateful now it's been about a decade in remission. But I remember early on, people wanting to just rationalize for me, because I would say things like, I'm struggling. Like, why would God let this happen? Right? Like, I'm a good person. I recycle, right? Like, why would God punish me? I'm a good person here.
Were you doing disaster relief already at that time?
Yeah, I'd already been doing it for about 8 years before that.
So that's what I mean. So you could also say, I literally go around the world and help people who are suffering. So you had a strong, I'm a good person resume potentially. So go ahead.
Yeah. It's like, and that was even actually, to be honest and transparent, that was even one of the things of like, God, why would you call me to do this work of helping others? And now I can't even get up out of bed. I'm so sick, right? But one of the things that I took away from that is, with the church, if we hear those expressions of doubt or struggle, sometimes it makes us uncomfortable and we start to shut down those who are asking those things. Or it's the sort of thing that we accuse them of not having enough faith. But, we look throughout the Psalms. I mean, there's just one after the other of those experiences of lament. So if you're, as a Christian, caring for someone else and they're asking these tough questions, don't shut it down. Don't tell them they're wrong. There's no way you can philosophize that person's pain away. And in fact, oftentimes when we ask those questions, in the moment, especially in those early moments of crisis, they're not actually just questions. They're actually lament that we are out loud expressing what we are feeling. So it's not going to do you any good to pull out Kierkegaard and try to make it all go away. So let the person be upset, let them be hurt, but love them. Because one of the things that we've seen in our other studies has been that when somebody experiences positive spiritual support from their church or like a neighbor, that they have lower levels of anxiety, lower levels of trauma, and they're more likely to see God as still loving. But you noticed I said positive spiritual support, right? Because I don't know about you, but like in the church I grew up in, we had a gossip chain, a prayer chain, right? Where, so not all support is positive.
Pray for sister so-and-so, Yeah,
exactly.
I'm about to say, we would have this thing like, pray for so-and-so. Did you know that she was outside doing A, B, and C? We really need to pray for her because her kids and her husband and, whatever. And so that was how we did things. You mentioned like your own suffering. That's one of the things, and also the laments. Here, there's like a strong place of identification. Because I talked about this I wrote a book, How Far to the Promised Land. I talked about what it was like as a kid to kind of experience like real suffering. And what it was like to pray to God for deliverance and not to have those things immediately be resolved. But I think that what allowed me to survive those things is that it was actually God who I spoke to. In other words, I always felt the freedom, maybe because in the Black church, we have the spirituals where it's just a part of our innate spirituality to acknowledge these things to God. And so for me, I've always said to people, it's okay. Like the danger in your spiritual life is not when you're complaining to God or you're praying or you're expressing these things to God. The real danger is when you stop talking to him. And that God isn't afraid of our questions. I always say to my people, God is never sitting in heaven saying, oh man, someone just put out a really cool book explaining that I don't exist. We should have a committee meeting before to figure this out, to fix my publicity. We need to inspire someone to write a counter book or we're doomed. God is utterly comfortable and utterly confident that he exists. He's not going, I guess I'm not real. I should just pop out of existence. And that's not to take those questions flippantly. It's to take this idea that if God is truth, if people run after that truth, they're going to find him. Now, you mentioned this, and what you just said, I don't know if that's the exact same thing. It's a study that you told me about earlier. But you said that people who have some kind of religious foundation tend to survive or do better in the aftermath of natural disasters or traumatic events. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we actually published a review article a few years ago for the American Psychological Association, where we went back and looked at every single research study that had been done for the last 40 years on religion and disaster mental health. And so if you kind of like step back and look across that literature, as well as like the studies that we've done, that more often than not, religion and spirituality helps to buffer against a lot of different negative outcomes that are common after a disaster, like trauma, for example. But once you start digging down into it, it's not as simple as who's religious or like who's the most religious, right? It's more about how we engage our faith is what predicts resilience. And so I'll give you a quick example. You've got two people that get hit by a tornado. The one person and both of them actually lose everything. Their house is grounded. They've lost everything. The one person says, God is sending this to punish me because of some unconfessed sin, and God is damning me for it. Whereas the other person is saying, I've lost everything, but I know that God is still a loving God. The person who views God as more loving in that situation is going to do much better. Same sort of thing with religious coping. If they're engaging in more healthy versus unhealthy coping practices, that again, that starts to impact our well-being. So it's really much more about how do we engage and utilize our faith.
Yeah. One of the things that I find so compelling about that is that there is this sense, and I'm one of I feel like I'm often stuck in between different Christian communities. I believe that the things that we do as Christians for our neighbors really, really matter. And I think it's important for Christians to love their neighbor in practical ways that you mentioned earlier. But I also think that the thing itself, Christianity, its central beliefs, its concerns, its teachings about who we are as persons and who God is in the world is also central. And the fact that you said, yes, practical help works and it's really important. But what the people believe about God actually helps them process and deal with trauma, helps me understand that the actual teachings of Christianity is important. In other words, it is not simply the acts of love, but the ways in which Christians help people understand their place in God's story that's important, such that when we're preaching the Bible faithfully, or when we're helping people to have healthy forms of Christian spirituality, we're doing not just an intellectual good, but an actual tangible good that helps them function in society and deal with setbacks. Am I using your example to say what I want to say, or did I actually
you're spot on with that. That theodicy belief really does make an impact on people, that the more that we're thinking about those issues ahead of time, the more it helps us when, things really do start to get bad. Because what happens is, where the struggle comes from is when our kind of head knowledge of God and our heart knowledge of God no longer line up, right? So when there's that like discrepancy, like maybe mentally, I know God is a good, loving God, but I just experienced something and I'm experiencing God as a hurtful God, that the more that discrepancy is there, that's where the struggle comes from. So if we're able to kind of think through it ahead of time and then wrestle with it, the more integrated, the better we'll be.
So we're not saying that instead of going to disaster relief places that you go there and you just preach to them and you don't help them at all. We're saying that in the communities that we inhabit, that we should provide some real deep spiritual formation. Now, I want to make sure before we end the podcast that I can put into practice some of the things that you have said. I don't know if Mike is still here on the podcast. Mike, are you still floating around or are you on mute? So Mike, because he said it is important that you have a positive relationship with your neighbors so that if something happens, they will trust you to be able to respond. I am going to be the bigger person. I'm sorry, I already messed it up. Because I was still trying to do the thing. I am going to, how do I say it? Apologize. And I want you to know that if something happens, Mike, you can depend on me. I am there for you.
Esau, some would argue I've already gone through a pretty traumatic event, thinking my car was lost to me. And I believe I remember Jamie saying that sometimes the best thing you can do to help people in a hard time is to send them a lot of cash. So I'll send you my Venmo and you can make a donation to the Strelo Fund.
Well, Mike, if I could just correct that. In addition to the cash, one of the best things you can truly do, though, is just to show up and be present. Right? Your presence says more than your words. And that's one of the things that we teach in Spiritual First Aid.
I think that's right. But with Esau, his cash is good enough. I don't need his presence.
So we will end the podcast not just saying that I'm the worst. We will end the podcast by saying it is true. One of the things that you can do, and I really think these are important things. I just want to sum them up because I just learned so much from you. Thank you so much for coming on, Jamie. The relationship that you build with your neighbors are essential in creating the kinds of trust that we'll be able to help us respond to disasters. There are tons of ways we can practically get involved with the people who are suffering. We can donate. We can volunteer in healthy ways. And within the communities that we inhabit, the ways in which we form people spiritually provides them the resources to be able to respond to trauma. We want to end this saying that we're praying for the people in California, and we know that we serve a God who is sovereign, who can even now limit the damage. And I want to hope you all join me in praying that things in California and in the other disasters that are taking place all over the globe will begin to dissipate. So thank you all for listening to the Esau McCauley podcast. I'll talk to you soon. Mike, it's good to be friends with you again. Jamie, it's good to talk to you again. We'll see you all next week. The Esau McCauley podcast is a production of Holy Post Media, produced by Mike Stay Low, Stray Low. If you know, now you know. Edited by Seth Gorbett, like a Corvette. Music by Rob Knorr. Make sure to follow the show wherever you get your podcast and leave a review so more people can find it. See you next time. I'm out.
I'm penning these letters with prayers they can aid your endeavors. It's clever benevolence, tasted it, wrestle with, still wrestling. Touch my side and it crushed my pride and told me I'm blessed within. Receive a Christian platitude with gratitude, but in the saddest news I live in doesn't add up to the Beatitudes. Catch me in the catacombs, chiefing like they Pat Mahomes, catching bullets, tackle foes, running plays, defending zones. Field got them doing football numbers, only half is grown. He was acting grown.